Delmarva, Absaroka, Nicajack. These are just a few of the many proposed states in the US that never quite made it to fruition. We'll be counting down 12 of the most unique state proposals ever made while diving into the strange history of each. Number 12. Transylvania, first proposed in 1775. If you're a history buff or a literary fan, the name Transylvania probably jumps out right away. Most people associate it with Dracula and misty castles in Romania, but the American Transylvania was founded 122 years before Bram Stoker's novel ever hit the shelves. Transylvania was slated to become the 14th American colony, made up of the lands that are currently a part of present-day western and southeastern Kentucky and part of northern Tennessee. It was the brainchild of the Transylvania Company, a land speculation outfit led by Richard Henderson, a former North Carolina judge who ditched the courtroom in 1773 for a shot at colonial greatness. On March 17, 1775, Henderson and his company claimed to have purchased the land from the Cherokee Nation in the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals. But the deal wasn't exactly fair. Many Cherokee leaders opposed it, and both the British Crown and American states quickly declared it illegal. And Virginia and North Carolina weren't having it. They insisted the land already belonged to them under colonial rule. Then came the American Revolutionary War, and with it, the death knell for Henderson's dream. The Continental Congress rejected the Transylvania colony outright, refusing to recognize it as legitimate. With no legal backing, the project collapsed. Virginia absorbed most of the land into what became Kentucky, and North Carolina followed suit in Tennessee. The Transylvania Company's grand plan fell apart, and so did Henderson's fortune. His legacy was a failed colony with a spooky name. The creators of the next state were a little lazy when it came to names. Number 11. Delmarva, first proposed in 1776. It probably comes as no surprise that there were several state proposals made immediately following the American colony's Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. Delmarva was one such proposed state. The territory would be made up of the small peninsula off the east coast of Maryland that split between Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. This is where the name Delmarva originated. Like we said, not very creative. The first formal call for independence from the Delmarva Peninsula came in November of 1776, just months after the colonies declared independence from Britain. During the drafting of Maryland's Declaration of Rights, delegates from the peninsula attempted to quietly insert a clause that would allow regions to secede from the state in the future. Their aim was to lay the groundwork for the peninsula to break away and form a new political entity. However, the proposal was rejected, and the idea of a separate state was put on hold. For the time being. The dream of Delmarva resurfaced decades later in 1833, this time with a different strategy. Rather than forming an entirely new state, lawmakers in Delaware proposed expanding their existing territory to include Maryland's eastern shore. The resolution gained significant traction, passing both chambers of the Delaware legislature as well as the Maryland House of Delegates. It looked as though the long-standing goal of unifying the peninsula might finally come to fruition. But it did not pass the Maryland Senate, and therefore the region was never incorporated into Delaware. In 1992, the Delmarva State Party was founded to revive the goal of forming a separate state. Advocates argued that the peninsula's population, around 750,000 at the time, was comparable to South Dakota's and projected to reach 922,000 in the next few decades. This population size, they claimed, justified statehood. Despite the effort and demographic argument, the movement failed to gain enough political traction. No significant legislative progress was made, and the proposal gradually faded from public attention. The next failed state is a David and Goliath story, except this time, Goliath won and forced its people into submission under the threat of execution. Number 10. Westsylvania, proposed in 1776. After 1748, a petition proposed creating a new colony named Vandalia in the region where modern-day West Virginia, western Pennsylvania, and eastern Kentucky are today. The colony never materialized, but its supporters persisted. In 1776, they rebranded the proposed colony as Westsylvania and submitted a new petition to the Continental Congress. The petition was ignored, and Congress took no action to recognize the state. Instead, much of the territory intended for Westsylvania was incorporated into Pennsylvania. Despite multiple attempts and significant backing, the proposed colony failed to gain legitimacy or approval, and Westsylvania remained an unrealized concept. Despite Congress ignoring their petition, Westsylvania's supporters remained committed to obtaining statehood. Residents of the region, removed from Pennsylvania's political center, believed they were neglected and misrepresented. Life on the western frontier was vastly different from that in Philadelphia, and the settlers felt their unique challenges and needs were not being addressed. In response, they began threatening to secede from Pennsylvania, hoping this pressure would force the government to acknowledge their demands. At best, they hoped for full independence and the creation of a new state. However, Pennsylvania responded swiftly and decisively. The state passed legislation declaring any promotion of Westsylvania or talk of secession would be seen as an act of treason. The punishment was death. This draconian response sent a clear message and effectively crushed the movement. Faced with the threat of execution, most supporters abandoned the cause. The dream of Westsylvania, like so many proposed states in early America, faded into history without ever being realized. The next proposed state only narrowly missed becoming the 14th state in the Union by a fraction of a vote. Number 9. Franklin, proposed in 1784. After the Revolutionary War, the United States found itself completely broke. To generate revenue, states began ceding western lands to the federal government, which in turn sold the land to settlers. This approach expanded national territory and funded government operations. North Carolina appeared to follow this practice when it ceded its western lands, present-day Tennessee, in 1784. However, a conspiracy was underway. The land was quickly claimed by local leaders who sought to form a new state, independent of both North Carolina and the federal government. This unauthorized effort led to the creation of the short-lived state of Franklin, revealing that the cession was not simply a patriotic gesture, but part of a plan to seize political control of the region and establish a separate government. North Carolina's leaders didn't simply cede their western lands out of patriotism. Instead, they sold the land at low prices to wealthy political insiders. Then they officially ceded the land to the federal government, but the scheme had a hidden motive. When the federal government eventually sold the land to settlers, these insiders expected a hefty cut of the profits. Their cheap purchases would turn into major gains once resold at market value. This maneuver allowed them to exploit a patriotic act for personal financial benefit, masking corruption as public service while manipulating the federal land sale process. Eventually, the new settlers to the region found out about the shady dealings that the North Carolinian elite were engaging in. They banded together and made a proposition that the territory west of the Appalachian Mountains secede from the North Carolina corruption and become its own state. This new state would be called Franklin. The settlers formally petitioned the federal government to become the 14th state. However, the proposal fell short by just 2 votes in Congress, missing the required 2/3 majority. Without federal recognition, Franklin's bid for statehood failed. As a result, the region had no choice but to abandon its independence efforts and reintegrate into North Carolina. The brief attempt at forming a new state ended without success or any official status. For our next proposed state, we're gonna head west, to the land of cowboys and Mormons. Number 8. Deseret, proposed in 1849. After the Mexican-American War ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, vast swaths of land came under U.S. control. These areas were soon organized into federal territories. However, one group, the Mormons, saw an opportunity. Seeking religious freedom and self-governance, they proposed creating their own state in the newly acquired land. In 1849, the Mormon community organized a constitutional convention to draft a constitution for the proposed state of Deseret. A bold move designed to petition Congress for official statehood. Their proposal was ambitious. Deseret would encompass the entire Great Basin, stretching across all of present-day Utah, Nevada, Arizona, Southern California, and parts of Colorado and Oregon. This would be by far the largest state in America at the time. The Mormons presented the proposed state of Deseret as a model of civil order during a time when the newly acquired Western territories had descended into pure chaos. The Constitution of Deseret was very similar to that of Iowa at the time. Mormon leaders ensured the document included a clear separation of powers and civil rights protections for all residents, not just members of their faith. Notably, the Constitution prominently guaranteed freedom of religion, reflecting the Mormons' desire for religious tolerance after facing persecution. This provision highlighted their commitment to building a state where diverse beliefs could coexist. It may be unsurprising to some that what actually ended up happening was that the Mormons used the state of Deseret as a civil branch of their religion. Things moved slowly in the 1800s, and while the federal government deliberated on the acceptance or rejection of the new state proposal, followers of the Mormon religion moved forward with their plans for Deseret. In 1847, Brigham Young led approximately 11,000 Mormons westward to settle the Salt Lake Valley and practice their faith without interference. Over the following decades, an estimated 60,000 additional Mormon settlers migrated to the area, building communities based on their religious principles. The Mormon Church maintained complete control over the politics and community of the region they designated Deseret. This did not sit well with many in Congress who had strong prejudices against the religion. There was also fierce opposition from the southern states. Deseret would have been an enormous free state in the West, and with the issue of slavery still tearing the country apart, Southern leaders saw it as a direct threat to their political power. With the Civil War still a decade away, the balance between free and slave states was a fragile, fiercely protected line. Fearing a shift in that balance, all of the southern states voted against granting Deseret statehood. In 1851, the federal government crushed the future of Deseret once and for all. Instead of adopting the Mormon proposal, the government created the Utah Territory, later becoming the state of Utah. The Mormons did not give up. They petitioned for Deseret statehood again in 1856, 1862, and 1872. However, as history has shown, these petitions were unsuccessful, and the Mormon state of Deseret never became one of the stars on the American flag. The next state name was proposed for 4 different regions of the United States, making it the most popular failed state name in American history. Number 7. Jefferson, proposed in 1859, 1870, 1915, and 1941. The first state proposal under the name Jefferson occurred in 1859 and was located west of the Kansas Territory at the time. This state was petitioned for by miners in the Rocky Mountains, and they actually got approval by the Kansas government to draw up borders. Unfortunately, the citizens of Jefferson could not come to an agreement over what should be included in the Constitution for the new state, and eventually, Jefferson became the Colorado Territory instead. The second Jefferson was located in Texas when the territory was incorporated into the United States. Texas was so large that as part of its admittance into the Union, it was agreed that the territory would need to be split up. This iteration of Jefferson was proposed in 1870 and would constitute all of southeastern Texas from the San Antonio River and the region around it. However, the proposal was shot down. Then, in 1915, a new Jefferson state proposal made its way to Congress and would once again carve territory out of Texas, this time in the West. However, there was almost no support for the new state, as only 6 state senators voted for approval. The third Jefferson proposal was in an entirely different part of the country. In 1941, a large number of people in the Pacific Northwest voiced their support for a new state of Jefferson that would be made up of Northern California and Southern Oregon. The supporters of this proposal were so serious that they even gathered up arms and marched through the area, passing out flyers that proclaimed they would secede from their current states. Soon after the new Jeffersonians gained momentum, Pearl Harbor was attacked, and the United States was catapulted into World War II. The government and American people had much more pressing matters to attend to, and the Pacific state of Jefferson was lost to history. The next couple of regions also seceded at another time of great turmoil in the United States. Number 6. Nicajack, proposed in 1861. As tensions over slavery escalated in the mid-19th century, not all Southern communities aligned with the Confederate cause. In the mountainous regions of North Alabama and East Tennessee, slavery was far less common. The terrain in these areas made large plantations impractical, resulting in fewer enslaved people and a more modest, rural economy. Many residents viewed the growing national divide not only as a conflict over slavery, but also as a deeper rift between wealthy elites and the working poor. These communities had little in common with the plantation aristocracy that dominated Southern politics and began to sympathize more with the Union than the Confederacy. It became clear that the Southern states intended to secede from the United States, so some communities in North Alabama and East Tennessee proposed a secession of their own and formed the state of Nicajack. However, the political structure of the time worked against them. Because enslaved individuals were counted towards representation, even though they had no voting rights, slaveholding regions gained disproportionate influence in state legislatures. This imbalance in political power doomed the Nicajack proposal to failure. The idea was ultimately rejected in the state Senate, and the region was forced to remain within Confederate-aligned states. Despite the legislative defeat, the anti-Confederate sentiment in the area persisted. Many residents resisted conscription into the Confederate Army, and some even joined Union forces, openly fighting against the Confederacy. Nicajack never became an official state, but it stood as a powerful symbol of Southern Unionism and internal opposition to the Confederacy. The failure of Nicajack highlighted the deep divisions within the South itself, divisions that went beyond the slavery debate and reflected broader economic and cultural fractures. While Nicajack's attempt at self-determination was suppressed, it set a precedent for resistance. Unlike Nicajack, the next state would successfully secede from their Confederate government, though not by legal means. Number 5. The Free and Independent State of Scott seceded and formed its own state in 1861. When the Civil War erupted, Scott County in Tennessee decided it would not be dragged into the conflict on the side of the Confederacy. So, the community seceded from its parent state to form the Free and Independent State of Scott when their home state decided to join the Confederacy. Like the Nicajack region, Scott County was rural, with a population that relied on small farms and modest incomes rather than plantation wealth. Most residents had no economic ties to slavery and saw no reason to support secession from the Union. Since the Tennessee government ignored the act of secession and did nothing to stop Scott County from leaving, technically, they succeeded. It remained an unofficial but self-identified independent entity for more than a century. Then, in 1986, 125 years after declaring independence, Scott County formally requested to rejoin Tennessee. The state welcomed the move with a public celebration, symbolically ending the county's long-standing claim to independence and dissolving the Free and Independent State of Scott. Scott County's act of secession stands as one of the few successful efforts, albeit unrecognized by the federal government, of a U.S. community breaking away during the Civil War. The next state is named after one of the most famous presidents in U.S. history. His name has been used twice in state proposals, but as any current map of the United States shows, the 16th president has yet to have a state named after him. Number 4. Lincoln, proposed in 1865. The idea of naming a state after President Abraham Lincoln has been proposed multiple times in U.S. history, though none of these attempts have succeeded. The first proposed state of Lincoln emerged as a result of Texas's annexation into the United States. Because Texas was required to divide its territory in order to join the Union, several new state ideas were floated. One of them, the state of Lincoln, would have encompassed the land south and west of the Colorado River. Despite initial discussion, the plan failed to gain momentum and quickly faded without action. A more serious attempt came from the Pacific Northwest. When Washington State, Idaho, and Montana were made into territories in 1864, there was uncertainty over which territory would govern the region now known as the Idaho Panhandle. Residents of the area, feeling politically and geographically isolated, drafted a petition to form a new state called Lincoln, but their proposal was rejected by Congress. Then, in the early 20th century, there was a resurgence of support for the state of Lincoln. This time, their ambitions were much larger, and the proposed state would also include eastern Washington, northern Idaho, and western Montana, stretching to the Continental Divide. Supporters believed the region's unique geography, economy, and political interests were distinct enough to justify statehood. However, despite local enthusiasm, the federal government again denied the request. Though the state never materialized, support for the state of Lincoln has persisted in regional discussions, especially when political or economic grievances with state capitals arise. The next proposed state thinks it's superior, literally. Number 3. Superior, first proposed in 1897. Michigan is unique in that it's divided into two landmasses, by Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. This physical split has fueled repeated suggestions that Michigan should be split into two separate states. The northern section would take on the name Superior, which, depending on how you say it, sounds a little, well, pretentious. The Superior State. The state of Superior. Just Superior. The name actually comes from Lake Superior, which borders the region, but you can't help but wonder if the folks pushing for statehood were being a little condescending by picking Superior over other options, like Ontonagon, which had also been proposed. There have been several iterations of the state of Superior, but they all contain a somewhat similar border. In 1897, a proposal for the new state included the northern half of Michigan along with part of Wisconsin. And although nothing ever came of this petition, it didn't stop Yoopers, people from Upper Michigan, from coming up with creative ways to get their own state. In 1959, a Michigander by the name of Ted Albert sued for divorce between the two peninsulas in hope that Superior would become its own state. Obviously, Albert's divorce argument failed to get really any results. In 1962, the Upper Peninsula Independence Association was founded to argue for the state of Superior. The association went as far as to submit a secession bill to the Michigan State Legislature with 20,000 signatures attached to the petition. However, in the state of Michigan, 56,000 signatures were needed in order for a ballot referendum to be introduced and voted on. Then, in the 1970s, northern Michigan combined forces with northern Wisconsin to try and make state Superior a reality. The residents of these regions felt that their taxes were too high as a result of the economic demands the southern parts of each state had compared to their own. Their argument was that the needs of the larger cities and areas of higher population densities were given precedence over their own. There was also growing resentment over the fact that both state governments, located in the southern parts of Michigan and Wisconsin, were passing environmental legislation that threatened the livelihoods of many northerners. In response, several legislators from the northern regions of both states proposed creating a brand new state, but nothing ever came of it. Interestingly, the state of Superior has recently been on the minds of northerners once again for the same reasons as it was in the 1970s. When Michigan started revising tax laws, there was discussion of secession in the north. Will there be another attempt at secession? The second-to-last proposed state would have been unique in that it would have created a state by Native Americans for Native Americans. Number 2. The State of Sequoyah, proposed in 1905. Throughout U.S. history, Native American communities have faced repeated injustices, especially regarding land and sovereignty. One of the most significant efforts by Native tribes to establish political autonomy came in 1905 with the proposed State of Sequoyah. This proposal aimed to create a Native American-led state in what is now Oklahoma. At the time, this region was not part of any U.S. state. It was composed of federally controlled land and Native American territory at the time. Much of the area had been given to Native American tribes through several treaties following the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Unfortunately, during this time, things were changing, and not for the better. In 1898, the U.S. government passed the Curtis Act, which was used to forcibly assimilate indigenous peoples into the American way of life. The act dismantled tribal governments and legal systems, effectively ending much of the sovereignty Native communities in the territory once held. In response, leaders of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole tribes organized a constitutional convention in Muskogee. Their goal was to preserve their cultural identity and maintain some degree of political autonomy. The result was a drafted constitution and Bill of Rights for the proposed state of Sequoyah, which would have been governed by indigenous leaders and structured like any other U.S. state. Unsurprisingly, the federal government was hesitant to create a state controlled by people whom they had been oppressing for over 100 years. Congress refused to even consider the 1905 proposal to form the state of Sequoyah, and it never even went to a vote. Instead, the federal government voted to create a different state which would encompass the Native American territory along with a significant amount of land to the west. This is how, in 1907, the proposed state of Sequoyah was destroyed and the state of Oklahoma was created. Our last state that never came to be may have had the most passive-aggressive secession in all of U.S. history. Number 1. Absaroka, proposed in 1935. The idea for the state of Absaroka may have existed before 1935, but it was during the mid-1930s that the movement gained real momentum. Like many other proposed states in American history, Absaroka was born from political frustration, this time in northern Wyoming, southern Montana, and western South Dakota. Residents in these sparsely populated areas felt ignored by their respective state governments. They watched public funding disproportionately support the more populous southern cities, while their communities remained underdeveloped and politically marginalized. The secessionist movement aimed to form a new state named Absaroka after the Absaroka Range of the Rocky Mountains. In 1939, the areas that would make up Absaroka first tried to secede from their home states. However, unlike more formal statehood efforts, the Absaroka campaign never followed legal channels. There were no constitutional conventions, legislative petitions, or appeals to Congress. Instead, the movement took a more passive-aggressive approach to secession. Supporters began issuing Absaroka license plates and even held a Miss Absaroka beauty pageant in 1939 to promote the state's identity. A man named A.R. Swickard emerged as a prominent leader of the movement. Declaring himself the governor of Absaroka, Swickard attempted to continue the illusion that the state of Absaroka was real. When World War II broke out and the United States entered the conflict, national priorities shifted dramatically. The country's focus turned toward wartime unity and production, and the citizens of the proposed Absaroka region set aside their ambitions for independence. Interest in secession waned, and the state of Absaroka quietly disappeared. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want to see more videos like this, then please consider subscribing and turn on notifications. It really does make a difference. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on MapPack.